Okay, I'm Ed Nersessian. I'm director of the Helix Center. Today's program is on living in the Anthropocene that was suggested to us by Nermin Sheikh, who is sitting there, and I think she had conversations about it with Don Moss and Akil Bilgrami. Before I tell you something about the participants, we have two more programs before the summer. On May 18, we have a program on shame, and on June 8, we have a program on status. I'm going to be super brief on the bios. The more extensive ones are available on our website. Akil Bilgrami is the Sidney Morgan Besser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. Amitav Ghosh is the author of The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, and of course many others. Dale Jamieson is Professor of Environmental Studies and Philosophy at New York University. W. John Kress is Distinguished Scientist and Curator of Botany at Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Donald Moss is a psychoanalyst, Program Chair of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and founding member of the Green Gang. Nermin Sheikh, co-host and news producer of Democracy Now! She will take over. As you know, we don't do moderating on these programs, but she will get things going. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. So just so everyone knows what the format is, there's roughly no format. We'll just begin talking, and it'll be a kind of free conversation. And after we've spoken for a bit, then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So I'd like to begin by asking John Kress, who's an environmental scientist, to just lay out the scene. What is the Anthropocene? When did it begin? And what are the most salient features of this period?
No.
Can you say it in 5 minutes?
Yes, I recently published a book called Living in the Anthropocene. I think it's appropriate to start with the scientific basis of where we're at in the year 2019 in terms of environmental change. And this is not just climate change, although we think of this as primarily a climate change and a global warming issue. There's a lot of alteration planet that are going on right now that make this broader than just pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. About 10,000, first I should say, the Earth, 4.6 billion years old, has been fluctuating in terms of the climate, the temperature, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, as well as life on the planet. We started out with single-celled organisms, and now we're primarily dominated in terms of physical presence and weight by multicellular animals, mammals, birds, plants. So there's this dynamic aspect of the Earth has been going on for a long time. But about 10,000 years ago, maybe 12,000, the end of the last major period of ice ages on the planet, Homo sapiens, humans were around at that point, and about 10,000, 12,000 years ago, suddenly the climate began to stabilize. And we don't exactly know what caused that stabilization, but the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere stabilized, the temperature stabilized, and that was the period when actually humans began to develop our own civilization, our own cultures. Agriculture began, domestication of animals began. So it was this long period of stasis that I attribute, and maybe some of my colleagues attribute, to how one species on the planet, namely Homo sapiens, humans, began or became the dominant species, controlling many of the aspects of how the planet functioned. That stability of that climate, particularly the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature, has now come to an end. All climate scientists agree that this period of stability is now moving into a period of great fluctuation. CO2 is increased in the atmosphere because primarily of the burning of fossil fuels, That has led to an increase in temperature because of the greenhouse effect, as many of you I'm sure are aware. The rampant use and abuse of resources around the planet, whether it's wood resources, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's fresh water, all of those abuses of natural resources has also radically begun to change in the last few years. And as Nermeen said, we're not quite agreed upon when we reached a point where change was such that we could maybe call this a new epoch of the planet, which used to be called the Holocene. But most scientists agree now that it was about the mid-1950s where we reached what is called the Great Acceleration, when all of these aspects of the environment reached a point where they all skyrocketed. So over that period of time since the mid-50s, we've now reached a period in the age of the planet where many of the aspects of stability are radically changing. And I think that's what we want to address today. What does that period of change, how is that going to affect, first of all, us as a species, but also how the rest of the planet functions, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's cycling of water, cycling of nitrogen, whatever. All those things are changing, and I think probably a lot of you are here because you are as concerned as we are about this period of rapid change. So I hope that's kind of what you wanted me to address in terms of setting the stage of where we're at.
Amitabh, what about, you've written this, which
very powerfully about the environment, about forests, about human beings in relation to the earth. Today, if you pick up, go into a bookshop with South Asian literature, it's really all urban stuff. It's all, a lot of it is political in the sense of being about politics, or it's about identity. But this other thing, this great reality that is outside us, hardly seems to impinge, on people's sensibilities. And that is, I think, to me, it's the big question. I mean, after all, Hurricane Sandy happened here in New York. It has a larger concentration of writers than almost any other place. But the curious thing is, can you think of the great Hurricane Sandy novel? There are novels about New York, drowning in the future. Many, several, but there's not a single book about New York's actual drowning.
But also, as you say in the book, so after this I'm not going to ask any more questions because I'm not supposed to, but in the book you also point out that when literature explicitly deals with these issues, it's almost always relegated to the realm of science fiction.
Yes, absolutely. You look at all the big reviews and so on. I mean, it's quite rare to see novels that deal with these issues ever being regarded as literary fiction. So, we subscribe to a notion of bourgeois seriousness, which by definition excludes these unlikely things, except that they're not so unlikely anymore. But I must say that in 2018, there was one book which I feel made a huge difference, and that's Richard Powers' book, Overstory, which was actually on the shortlist for the Man Booker Prize. And I think, I can't go into all of it right now, but I think this book is a very significant event in literary history, really.
All of you really. It's a very interesting thing that even progressive and left-leaning writers, thinkers, pretty much till 20 years ago at most, never really thought very much about nature, but never thought about future generations.
Novelist Bonnie Nadzim called Love in the Anthropocene. And we were on various public radio shows and so on, and I come from the world of philosophy and environmental science, not the world of literature, although writing fiction was fun. And I remember this phrase, idea fiction, being used in a derogatory way. It wasn't that this is didactic. No, it was just the very idea that the fiction somehow carried an idea already seemed to be a strike against it. I think so there's something there, I think, in the world of literature. I mean, the other thing is, it's extremely difficult, I think, to write about the Anthropocene, especially when we understand it in the way that the excellent explanation was given. I mean, we're really talking about the disruption of all these cycles, not just the carbon cycle. And all this is happening at the same time that technology is increasing radically, that globalization is speeding up incredibly. And when we tend to focus on one thing, I mean, I want to tell you about a climate change world, or I want to tell you about a technologically advanced world. We tend to focus on that thing and then tell the story sort of as if everything else gets held constant and this thing changes. But that's not the future. That's not next week. That's not next month. It's a matter of...
And what was it about? It was about the destruction of the sacred cedar forest by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So the earliest literature we've ever had was about power, but was also about the relationship between man, or humans, and nature, and about the destruction of nature. So that history of literature goes way back, and what's happened in the last 30 years is one perspective, but what's happened in the last 5,000 years is a different.
But it's also that, you know, much like writing about war is not about all wars or the conditions that give rise globally to wars, but rather a particular war as a backdrop. So similarly with the Anthropocene, I would imagine that any kind of literary writing would take one, what's come to be known as an extreme weather event, or and situate the story within that context. At least that's the way that I understand it. But Don, you gave a very interesting paper in Iceland, which I had the pleasure to hear, on slow violence and the slow violence of climate change or climate catastrophe, as you made the argument, in fact, that it should not be just called change, because that's too benign a word. So why don't you say a little about that?
Chime in. Before saying anything about that, I wanted to say something about what psychoanalysts have been working on for not quite entirely, well, yes, for 120 years or so. And I think that one of the things one would conclude from looking at psychoanalytic literature is that there's a deep lack of interest in the future. That is, the entire discipline is organized. Freud had the famous phrase that neurotic people suffer from reminiscences. And in saying so, the notion would be that people like us who are interested in neurotic people would be focusing on the pathogenic consequences of reminiscences, and essentially be thinking of people, the labor of becoming a person would essentially be the labor of liberating the work completed. And I think that it seems to me, I just want to say one other thing about that, sort of about that. John and I were coming up here together, and I was, maybe many of us, we watch these Discovery Channel things, and we watch threatened mammals and see how they do and what they're doing. And I was watching one recently, and I saw all these threatened mammals. And what they do is do their best to adapt to the threat. So if there isn't sufficient ice, they try to make do with the ice that they find. If there isn't sufficient ice in spot A, they try to move to spot B. If it's too cold here or too warm here, they move up the mountain. But the task is an immediate one. You don't have a sense that any of these animals, and I think it would include a huge percentage of humans, that our task always feels either immediate, to escape the immediate threat, or to escape the regressive pull of the past. And so few of us, and maybe none of our whatever we call them, primates and earlier in the chart, have any notion of the future at all. The one thing I would add about progressive literature, it seems to me Marx is an exception. That at least the Marx that I loved was always written with the future in mind. That is, the whole notion was future-oriented. That the entire notion of what the human task would be. Hegel interpreted the world, our task is to change it. So there you have this contribution that was future-oriented, and in that sense, well, just that, okay.
Jack, can I ask you, Amitav spoke about the lack of consciousness and literary writing about these issues, and John trying to diagnose it for psychoanalysis. But isn't it also true that geology, until it became geosciences, was also very focused on the lithosphere? I mean, they were focused on solid rock and...
Focused on what, Akhil? We didn't understand.
The lithosphere, the solid rock or molten rock below the surface or sedimentary phenomena, but it wasn't focused on the hydrosphere or the atmosphere or the biosphere, and all that's now become part of an understanding of what these sciences should be doing. But I assume it's because of this very narrow focus that they didn't look at the data correctly or something?
Well, I think that's what they had to look at. They had fossils and they had the hard part of the planet to actually study. But now that we're also interested in how the atmosphere and how the hydrosphere and the biosphere is changing, I think scientists, not just geologists, but environmental scientists such as myself, are trying to go back and look and use data that we can find to look at these other parts of the sphere, so ice cores and such, where we can actually interpret what went on in the atmosphere 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 years ago. So it's very interesting. You bring up, I mean, I think of paleontologists when you talk about geologists. And all my paleontologists at the Smithsonian, my paleontologist colleagues, who are always looking back, Don, as you say, they all, when I bring up the Anthropocene, they all say, don't worry. John, relax. Don't worry. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Life has been around for 3.2 billion. If you're worried about the future of life, don't. Because life will go on. We're one species. Things will radically change. If you're worried about your grandchildren, you should be. You should be really worried. Or you're worried about your great-grandchildren. So I think that
What's the distinction? Sorry, I don't understand. That means you should worry about the species, or you shouldn't
shouldn't
worry about them long term.
species.
You should only worry about it immediately.
Right.
I see.
That it's the future generations of humans that are going to suffer the most. It's not life on the planet. Even though we are now responsible for 1,000 times greater rate of extinction than happened 200 years ago.
What I'm curious about is that before the last, the time scale being so huge,
No, I don't.
do you just see the short-term trends as noise and dismiss them? What was the...
No, it wasn't dismissed at all. I think it was made more relevant by what's happening on the planet today. So suddenly that was academic understanding of changes in atmosphere and hydrosphere. Now, with the changes that are happening in the world today, that data collected in the
That's
past...
what I mean. So earlier, did they dismiss what we now see as short-term trends in...
no, they didn't care about it.
They just didn't...
Or they weren't that concerned about it.
So there's two different issues here. I want to go back and pick up on something on adaptation, but on this issue, I mean, there's really interesting issues in epistemology and the history of science here. So, so if you take someone like Arrhenius, for example, in 1903, I mean, essentially those calculations that he made on long, cold, boring Swedish nights on the back of an envelope have basically turned out more or less to be right, although we have a very different understanding of the mechanisms that actually make that change possible. I mean, I think there's two things in response to your question, Akhil, that should be noted. And maybe in some ways they're kind of boring, I don't know. But one thing had to do with the development of supercomputers. The development of supercomputers, which allow you to do all kinds of things in terms of simulating futures that could simply not been done before. I mean, I was around the National Center for Atmospheric Research, for example, the first time that people were able to link ocean models with atmosphere models, for example. That sounds like an obvious thing to do, but it's something you actually could not do until the early 1980s when you had the computing power to do it. At the same time, I think you're also on to kind of a sociological fact, which is the kind of science that we grew up on was a kind of science that, without stating this explicitly, sort of assumed that nature seeks equilibria, and that divergence from equilibrium states are some way driven by something sort of weird and exogenous to the system. The kind of early biology, for example, that sort of talks about climax ecosystems and so on is of that mode. We're now in an era where we tend to see disequilibrium and chaos, if you will, as more the natural state of things. Now, that isn't a purely scientific discovery. That has something to do with the changes in political and social climate and the kind of cultural, settings in terms of how we look at the data.
So it's epistemological, but driven by these things. Right. And I was just wondering to what extent just looking at the time scale in very large terms just makes us dismiss these things as noise. But it's interesting, the equilibrium, that's a sort of theoretical pre-commitment which would drive one to it too. Yeah.
If I can just say one thing in response to your comment about kind of how science has changed over the last 30 years. When I was a graduate student studying tropical ecology, my job was to go out and find a pristine habitat in nature and study the biology, study the interactions between the organisms, and try to find out how nature works. That is no longer the paradigm anymore. The paradigm is to go out and find out how humans are affecting those systems. It's totally changed. You can't find a single graduate student in environmental sciences that is going out to look at a pristine system because they do not exist anymore.
I wonder whether there are any, like if you think about the Anthropocene as a kind of, I mean, it's a silly word to use, but let's say pathology, a kind of, what's the word? A catastrophic change in what had been a stable form of life, let's say. And then there's this pathogenic series of events that we're talking about. So are there any, in medicine, in any zone, in all the humanities, is there any zone in which contemporary pathologies are being addressed in a serious way with the future in mind? Or is all serious address of pathologies organized around eliminating the pathology, at which point the aim would be accomplished? Are there pathologies being addressed with a serious focus on generations to come? I say,
what the nomenclature of Anthropocene is intended to capture, better be much more open-ended, right, and not thought of in these terms. Anyway, something to get other people to.
What do you mean by open-ended?
That is, it isn't as if there is some telos towards which some messianic end.
Yes.
Right? It's something.
You mean uncertainty? You mean?
Yeah, uncertainty. and therefore, keeping a very wide range of options open as to what might be done about it, or both by way of constraint, and actually a preparedness to be reactionary, to say, let's just go back. The future might be a better, there might be better outcomes in the future if we were actually against modernity, or against, so even that should be a possible option. So that's what I mean by open.
Yes. Wilding, the notion of wilding, it would be something.
So be more conservative and not be radical in the sense of, thinking we can change anything at our will, etc.
But isn't going back, isn't that change?
No, it is change, but it's not the kind of thing that that Hegel, Marx, and other figures thought of, brought in the future in the way that you had noticed.
I mean, we tend to have these two orientations towards the future. One is utopianism, which is largely disastrous in terms of human history, in my opinion. And the other is muddling through. And the amazing thing, which is what we actually do most of the time, and the amazing thing about muddling through is not that it actually works, it's that it seems to work. And it seems to work in part because of this incredible power of adaptation that humans have, both to adapt to changing circumstances, but also to adapt their preferences and desires about things. And so when people talk about the Anthropocene and how terrible the 21st century is going to be and so on and so forth, it's a very delicate thing to talk about because there's lots of things I want people to do in response to this. But look back at the 20th century. Unbelievable disaster. Millions and millions and millions of people killed. Vast parts of the planet destroyed and despoiled. A decade after Rome was in rubble and people were eating cats, it was La Dolce Vita. I mean, with very little sense of how close people were to those events. And I think one mistake that we make about thinking about the future is when we imagine the world in 2020, when things are really getting going, or 2030 or 2040, we imagine ourselves into that future with the baselines from where we come and the preferences we have and the desires we have. But the people who are going to be born into that world are not going to mourn the same things that we would mourn were we to be born into that world. And that makes it even more difficult, I think, to think about the future from where we are now on these long time scales.
Well, Amitav, actually, one of the things in your book which was very striking is you cite the example of Gandhi, of course, who was one of the early figures, prominent figures, to understand that modernity in its present form, and one can only say that it's accelerated since then, to recognize that the form of life that was giving rise to would simply not be possible.
It was taking us to disaster. The Chartists knew it, the Luddites knew it. Around the world, wherever this thing went, people tried to resist. I mean, just today I was reading about how in the 19th century, the Bonapartist state was trying to impose certain forestry regulations on Italy, and how strongly the Alpine peasants resisted, because actually they held land in common. There was no tragedy of the commons. They held land in common and they regulated it. So I think we forget sometimes how new this regime of property is. We also forget that before the 18th century, really people everywhere around the world understood that there are certain limits. You have to act in certain ways. You have to act for the future, as they did in Japan during the 17th century. So none of those things is really...
But a view to the future in this sense of shrinking resources and the possibly injurious effects of consumption, acquisition. This was of the examples that you're citing?
Yes.
it was just a more communally oriented?
It was that, but it was also that people recognized. So I'm certainly with Akhil. I think at this point, I think the thing we have to understand really is that this disaster has been brought upon us by essentially the 19th and 20th centuries, what we call education, what we call rationality. And I would say that in this, psychoanalysis plays a very large part. I say this as someone who, loved to read Freud, but you can see in retrospect that in a way it's a part of a whole constellation of things that has brought us, to this disaster. And really the task ahead of us is to try and unlearn. Just today I was reading such an interesting book. It's on art and the Anthropocene, So in the Little Ice Age, as it was advancing, the last great sort of atmospheric fluctuation was in the 17th century. So in India, for example, the Emperor Akbar, very early on, he responds to this in an artistic sense. The droughts and the terrible atmospheric disturbances. They commission, a lot of art around this, but also they commission, all sorts of waterworks, all kinds of. So it entered their minds in a way that this doesn't enter our mind now. And why is that? It's because we've been educated.
Psychoanalysis. So those four words put in a cluster, I think what you're getting at is the kind of emergence of what could be called, what do we say, a kind of fetishized individual. And that the educated individual is a fetishized individual and a fetishizing individual. That is, who turns his or her individuality into a magical talisman which represents success, and who turns other individuals into talisman also. So I think you hold psychoanalysis, at least in part, responsible for that. I mean, you said it. I'm not just inferring that. You just said it, and I agree with you. It's hard to say responsible because I think it's actually hard to locate responsibility anywhere when you think about a historical trend, modernity. Well, can one name the responsible agent for modernity? It wouldn't be easy to do, and nor would it be easy to hold one responsible for wanting to become a modern person. It's hard to locate responsibility in there.
True, it's hard to attribute it to that form of agency, but one could make helpful diagnostic attempts by noticing. So if you take some of the concepts that Dale and Amitav that surfaced in things they said. So if you take the tragedy of the commons, right? The tragedy is supposed to arise because commoners are supposed to ask the sense in which this notion of rationality, whether it's fresh air commons or pastoral or agricultural commons. So these things are, I don't know what about agents, but they're outlooks that emerged in pretty much since the mid-17th century.
Okay, I'd like to just say something there. I think we have to remember that this guy Gareth Hardin, who wrote that paper on the tragedy of the commons, he was a white supremacist, he was a eugenicist, a fascist really, and his idea of the commons comes from exactly what you're saying, which is this idea that people who think of themselves as maximizing individuals, if allowed upon the commons, will destroy the commons.
There is in North America and Europe right now.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's North America. I mean,
Yes.
it's essentially that kind of, this cornucopian idea that you have once English settlers come to America, that the land will always provide, and each one for himself.
And it also, that also raises the question of agency, right? When we speak of these, like, can you fault someone for wanting to be a modern individual? The question could also be asked, does one leave people with a choice to be anything but a modern individual? It's not as though, now you see it in all of these movements, indigenous peoples in Latin America, peasants in large parts of South Asia. They are being forced by various systems, capitalism obviously one of the most egregious, to adapt and adopt ways of life, because simply the way of life that they've had is no longer tenable. And it's no longer tenable because of these larger system structures that are propelling them outside a form where for them there is no other outside.
I think that's absolutely right. But I don't think there's any response that one can make once one acknowledges what you're quite rightly pointing out, except to say that even when we are shaped by the structures that you describe, we go in and out of being cooperative and non-cooperative. In some frames of thinking, it wouldn't dream of us to ask, what if I cooperated and others didn't? I'm not going to cooperate. There are many, many contexts, quotidian contexts, where one is completely, the question never occurs to one to ask that deeply alienated question, which you're saying is shaped by structures of modern society. And yet, in many public contexts, that's precisely how we think, in this way of modern rationality and so on. So really, I think it's a very important task of politics to try and see how we can scale up the context in which we are not driven by those ideals of rationality, scale them up so that they yield the conceptual resource for us to criticize the other frame in which we think. That should be a very central goal of politics.
Sorry. I keep having things I want to ask, but then we keep moving on and I forget what I was going to. I will just throw out a couple of things. One is climate change is a problem that exists today. And it wasn't a subject that people talked about 50 years ago. They didn't talk about, like you said, when I was at university, we didn't worry about climate change. So that since it has now become a problem, we can look back and say, well, we did all these things wrong. Where we are today. Now we didn't do it completely right, but we didn't know how to do it completely right. So that's why we are here, and we should try to fix it. The other thing that that occurred to me is that in a way, Freud came up and criticism of Freud came up, but the fact is, when religion dominated everything, then you assumed that God would take care of everything. There wasn't this idea that we are so powerful that we are going to fix things that God isn't going to take care of. We just have to be good, go to confession, and eventually things will work out. So it's more of a concern, become more of a concern now, where there's a diminution of religion, there's less effect of God on everybody's thinking, and so it's become a major concern. Devastating effect on people's lives. Those are just random thoughts that I was thinking as you were talking.
So just two things. One is, without really disagreeing with the historical story, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, for example, climate change was mentioned by President Johnson in a message to Congress in 1965. There has really been something like a concerted attempt to obscure the continuous history of the knowledge of this.
Two books are reviewed in the New York
Yeah.
Times for the weekend, where they say that it was already in Congress in the 70s.
It absolutely was.
But then it happened.
Right.
It happened.
Right. So so that's a whole other issue. But what's tended to happen is that about every 10 years, people wake up and look around and say, "What's this climate change stuff? Nobody ever told me about this," and then become somnambulent again, until the next upsurge. But I want to go back to this agency issue, because I really think that this is key. It's not just indigenous peoples who view themselves as being involved in coercive systems. It's also people, who live in the suburbs, who want to take their kids to school and would like not to burn gasoline, but don't feel that there's any other way of doing this. And I think, one of the things that I think is really central to sort of the meaning of the Anthropocene is that the kind of coercive structures that humanity used to feel imposed on itself by nature are now imposed on us by our social, political, and economic systems. And if anything, this vice of coercion feels to people, I think, across nations and societies, as rigid, perhaps even more rigid and inescapable as the vice of nature once felt to people.
Why so? But would you say that the word coercion, it's interesting, but the word coercion, in order to feel coerced, you have to be imagining non-coercion. You have to have an image, a realistic image of something that feels real to you. Oh, it could be otherwise. We would need that in order to feel coerced today. So, but if the source of coercion is nature, are people imagining an alternative nature such that, I'm just trying to distinguish between coercion and necessity. So nature might induce necessity, at least as I would think, whereas capital induces coercion.
Yeah. I suppose it depends on how you experience this from nature. So if you experience this through a god, for example, and particularly a wrathful and arbitrary god, maybe that stands somewhere between the necessity of nature and the coercion of something that looks like capital. I don't know. And I'm not so invested in the comparison anyway. What I think is really important is again, this kind of weird paradox where it's humanity who's remaking the planet. It's not nature in the non-human sense. It's not aliens, from somewhere else. It's us that are doing it. But yet there is this sense of powerlessness.
I think about it not necessarily coercion, but constraints and restraints. And earlier, nature wasn't a constraint, because nature, when Europeans landed in North America, it was an endless garden. Even though there were a lot of other people here already taking care of that garden. So nature seemed to not constrain us. We've reached a point where we realize that resources are finite now for our population use. And we could argue when those finite resources will run out or when they won't run out. But we realize that the planet is a certain size. And we also realize that there's more of us on the planet using those resources. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're beginning to feel that constraint being ourselves rather than nature beforehand.
Do you think the fault line was earlier when we actually began to equate nature with natural resources? Right? It's fine it's true what you say, that resources will run out, but that's still a very anthropocentric way of seeing the problem. It does seem to me that we at some point transformed the concept of nature into the concept of natural resources, And that transformation was a fault line in landing us in the midden that we are in.
For sure. You mean it turns nature into quantity? That's what you mean?
No, as you see, this goes back to what Ed was asking, which is if you desacralize nature at some point, nature first got equated without remainder, exhaustively equated with the idea of what the natural sciences study. Right? So nature contained no properties that the natural sciences don't study or can't study. Right? Now, I think that's a superstition of modernity.
Yes.
It's you know, many people who I know and admire who have great concern for climate change, like my friend Peter Singer, your friend too, that's how he would see nature as that which the natural sciences study and try and recover such environmental anxieties that he has and develop them within that assumption. But I think the assumption is wrong.
I as a natural scientist, I believe that nature exists outside what natural scientists can study. It has no, I mean, there will be nature on the planet long after natural scientists are gone.
No, that's true. That's a slightly different point, and I think that's perfectly correct. But what I'm suggesting is that some kind of baby was thrown away with bathwater, which is that value properties got evacuated as well from nature. And I'm saying you can be an atheist and insist that nature contains value properties which should constrain our behavior towards nature. And I'm saying that a lot of scientists, not doing science, but doing philosophy in their own time, have equated nature with what the natural sciences study. So when Dawkins says things like that, he's not talking as a scientist. He's talking about as a public intellectual or philosopher. And as Wittgenstein said, only a philosopher could say something as absurd as that.
I have one thought about what you're saying having to do with something I think is quite potentially useful about psychoanalysis in this regard. And it's a Melanie Klein notion of set of resources. And let's say that the infant is in that sense a natural scientist in relation to its mother so conceived. And then comes this fateful moment, so says Klein, in which the nature of the position is changed, and the nature of the change is toward a depressive position, with the implication of a kind of melancholy acceptance of the mother's limitation, of the limitation in her resource capacity, but at the same time, a huge expansion of her status as, as something other than resource. So losing her as a source of unlimited resource, that's the cost. The gain is a vision of her as an entity that needs protection, no less than I do. And in that sense, there's something, there's something theorized in psychoanalysis that I think is kind of very congruent with what you're saying.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
But it's obviously not the aspects of psychoanalysis that Amitabh was saying.
No.
Can I ask the two of you to talk a bit about that?
If he starts.
about you made some rude remarks about psychoanalysis.
No, I mean, I was just following. I mean, because, as you said,
We were both saying this.
yeah. I mean, it individualizes. There comes to be a reliance upon individual histories, upon the past. But I think the important thing that we can't forget here. Well, two things. I must say, for me now, I find Jung's thinking much more interesting in relation to the Anthropocene. The other thing is that I think we can't forget here that really, one of the major scientists writing the IPCC said the other day, that climate change is not a natural phenomenon. It's actually the ongoing effect of inequality. And especially those of us who are from India or China or Indonesia or wherever, this is the thing. I mean, the solving or the addressing of climate change is no longer in Western hands. It's really going to be decided in Asia because Asia has the weight of numbers. And the reason why nobody can go to an Asian population and say, cut back your emissions, is because they say, well, we just want what they have. It's just that. I mean, that's really the fundamental dynamic that drives it.
But I think that,
Is there a way out of this except through science?
Well, I'd just like to follow up on your point. We haven't really talked about economic systems yet and the impact of economic systems on climate change. And some of you may know there's ecological economics now, which is beginning to rise as an alternative to capitalistic economics and neoliberalism and such things. It seems to me, my reading of the literature, which is that economics is not immune to natural laws, is not immune to science, is not immune to social interactions, but really depends on that in a way. And we have to change our system. And psychoanalysis does have to.
yeah,
But Freud wrote about the future of an illusion and
Civilization and its discontents.
discontents, where he addressed that. But he addressed that in a very scientistic way.
yes, exactly.
He just thought of these as counter drives to the drives of the id.
Yes.
There you go.
So we should open up for some questions.
Thank you all. It was a very interesting talk. My question will be for all of you, anybody who'd like to answer it. I'm going to make a couple of quick generalizations so I can formulate it into a question. So the idea of the tragedy of the commons was that if everybody was selfish and acted individually, it would be a tragedy. And on the other side of the argument, Eleanor Ostrom got a Nobel Prize by saying people don't do that in ordinary life. They act as communities and they see holistically and they work it out.
Who's the Ostrom?
Eleanor Ostrom.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's these two alternative possibilities. Now, again, to oversimplify so I can ask the question, when civilizations are characterized, it's simplified by saying all civilizations have put the community before the individual. Western civilization is the first civilization where the individual was put on a pedestal before the community.
In despair.
They're all depressed.
You don't sound.
I just
If
want to
you're
add.
really depressed, you wouldn't be here, right?
I want to add as a sort of maybe a corollary to your question that I haven't heard today here among the panelists any sort of solutions that don't seem to touch on some form of coercion of some type, that either through guilt, through a sense of guilt, or through regulation. And those are two different things.
Regulation is absolutely necessary. It's just not sufficient.
So this isn't an answer to your question. I'll leave other people to confess how they manage their inner lives. But there's two things that always really strike me about this question, which I get a lot. The first is I'm doomed. We are doomed. We're all going to die as individuals. I mean, whatever people figure out or don't figure out about life in the 23rd century. And I think there's something for psychoanalysts here about why it is we're so concerned about collective doom and somehow so much in denial on an everyday basis about the probability of one, about my individual doom. So that's just
I think you said it, fear about grandchildren.
Well, so I mean that's just one question. The other thing is that when it comes to these civilizations that we've built and what threatens them most, as someone who's worked on climate change for decades, I can tell you, at least with complete confidence on my part, that it's nuclear weapons. That it's nuclear weapons that will really put an end to anything like the civilizations that we all know and treasure.
Exactly.
Climate change may do that. It certainly will cause enormous amounts of death and suffering. If humanity survives in a recognizable form, it's not going to be very recognizable to us. But nuclear weapons, this is certain destruction, and the probability of this happening is very great on relatively short time horizons. So I just find it kind of puzzling, the kind of freak out, the level of people's freak out about climate change compared to our complacency about nuclear weapons and our denial about this death that awaits me in the not too distant future.
If I could kind of respond to that, I think those are just two examples of the possibilities. You brought up geoengineering. That's in response to climate change, but that's another attempt by Homo sapiens to control things. And I think we will see many more of those if we continue on. As a natural history scientist, I don't really care about humans, to tell you the truth. I care about the 10 million species on the planet that are being disproportionately affected by what one species does. There's no other species on the planet that makes other species go extinct. There's one, and they're all sitting in this room. And so
Not all of them.
No.
John, can I ask you? Can I ask you a question? So somebody sent me an article recently on the disappearing insect species, and apart from pollution, the other major cause is apparently agriculture. Now, can I just ask, on the one hand, in the last several decades, there's increasing urbanization, and fewer and fewer people are actually living off agriculture, making their living off agriculture. Even in a country like India, which was 80%, is now 49% agriculture. And it's just where everything is headed, right? So I'm sort of not getting it. Is it some notion of agricultural what? I mean, are the inputs so much more productive that
Exactly. There's two things. That there is not less agriculture now. There is more efficient agriculture. Through mechanization, such as the dam tractor, which has really changed things. So fewer people were needed to do the same thing.
So it's productivity due to inputs.
Yes, and the second is the Green Revolution, which required a lot more fossil fuels and a lot more pesticides. And it's those pesticides that are...
And monocultures.
And monocultures, which is a result of that, which require more. So there's more of us, so there has to be actually more agriculture to be feeding us.
I mean, people are being dispossessed of their land. They're sort of being pushed into destitution. And yet, agriculture is being intensified in these ways through these more efficient inputs to give rise to. I mean, it just seems like
it's obscene. But John, you'll obviously know, but it's also, they say, meat, the consumption of meat all over the world, that agricultural land is now being used more and more.
All of that part of the Amazon that now is devoted to growing soybean is for feeding the cattle, not for feeding.
I think we have another question.
I mean, can I just make one comment about meat consumption? Because I think this is hugely important, because we talk about developing world and they want to be like us and all this, but the real time bomb is increasing meat consumption in poor countries. And interestingly, India has some values to dampen that down, and the Chinese government has a policy in place to try to reduce beef consumption rather than have it grow. And I think these are things that are not well enough appreciated in the West.
Can I just say something in response? Who's the gentleman? You asked the question, right? Sorry, we don't mean to disregard that. I understand the point, the question you have about teaching and, the questions that you get from some of your... I work at Democracy Now! It's an independent television news show here in New York, and after our broadcasts, often we have groups of students who come to watch the live broadcast, and then we go and we speak to them. And of course, as, young people, they all want to know, and obviously Democracy Now! People have said, you should rename it Depress Me Now, because the news is just relentlessly awful. So, after you watch an hour of Democracy Now!, obviously you just think, okay, which cliff can I go throw myself off of? But, I think that, yeah. So, there are a couple of things. One, I think that, I don't know how much of a solace it is the space is not between hope and despair. Right? Where the option is not between hope and despair. I think being, the way that, forgive me for saying this, but in the US in particular, there's a massive emphasis on optimism and, feeling good and I'm great and terrific and this kind of thing. This is just, it's at a very shallow level, which has very little meaning or duration. So that's not... I don't think that's the alternative to despair. I think, also in light of what, people here have been talking about, is the question of solidarity, right? Solidarity in the sense of feeling mutually both implicated, bound, and responsible. Now, whether that induces more despair or more hope, I don't know. But it subverts or, somehow looks at the problem of individual despair through a different lens.
Thank you. I like that. Could I respond to that too? Sorry. At the Smithsonian, we've been struggling with this for a long time because we don't, as a public museum or a series of museums, hate the idea of telling the public that we're pessimistic. It's just not the best way to engage. So we have started something called Earth Optimism Day, where it's more the solidarity, exactly what you're saying. It's to present cases where we have succeeded in changing things, but at the same time point out all the issues that one has to realistically understand to achieve those optimistic successes. So there's a way to do it. I have a hard time doing that because I'm a little on the pessimistic side, but I think we are getting towards that a little bit.
I thought the Times reported that a substantial majority of Americans in a survey said they were prepared to pay 15% more for energy bills and have the money spent on clean energy programs. So that's a sign of some sign of optimism.
I just have to say that these surveys go back decades, and the problem is people are always willing to pay more if the money goes for some shiny new thing. The real reason to make people pay more for energy is so it'll function as a Pigovian tax and get them to consume less.
Sure.
That is what's unacceptable.
This
is what they always say. I could pay more, but not so much more that I have to use less of it. Oh, no, not that. But that's the whole point of the tax, fundamentally. We'll see this with congestion pricing. This is another place it's going to play.
I would just add that neither hope nor despair is a strategy. Leadership and action are what we need. But to my question, this is not the first time in our history that we've faced a crisis like this, perhaps not this grand. But ultimately, it boils down to a political crisis. And more often than not in history, scapegoating has been used rather than trying to find a solution to the crisis. And, the 20th century is replete with that. And now we find, that climate change is a Chinese hoax. He hasn't said that in a long time, but he probably will if he needs to. But does anyone have, now that we've discussed the problem, does anybody have any suggestions for political action that we could take as individuals or collectively?
Ben Shapiro, the right-wing ideologue, he recently tweeted that the way to solve the climate crisis is to bomb India and China's coal-fired power plants. And, it's a curious thing. I think if we were in a different world, that would be the political response.
Well, like the first thing is, I think there's so much about the way we misconceive this issue. And one is climate change is not a problem. Climate change is out of the box. That essentially all of these Anthropocene forcers, which are fundamentally about destabilizations of natural systems, are simply going to condition and affect life on the planet for the next few centuries, unless we do something even crazier, like geoengineering, for example, right? So those destabilizations of natural systems throw up and produce a wide range of real problems, like sea level rise, for example, droughts, extreme events that people are going to have to respond to. But there's not a solution to climate change now. There was at a time. There could have been an energy transition at a time before we got committed to 1.8 degrees centigrade, and probably are going to go to 3 or 4 or 5 before this thing turns around. So the way we have to think about this issue is no longer in the problem-solution space. When it comes to the obvious things, sure, we have to get the idiots out of office, but it's not, but look, we're living in a... Who was it? Madison or somebody once said a long time ago that one of the framers that the fundamental weakness of the American political system is that the people cannot be impeached, and that's essentially what we're dealing with in this.
But look, come on, that can't be right. It's just so typical of us intellectuals when something happens to blame the people rather than the institutions. And Fred Jameson said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I don't know if there's any solution, whatever solution there is to climate change problem, it probably involves such constraints on capital that it brings about a terminus of capitalism. And then Jameson's thought is, so we just don't have the conceptual wherewithal in our political zeitgeist to even so much as think that.
But we do have to take. Look, this was a throwaway line about impeaching the populace, but we do have to take seriously that there is no system of governance that has ever been created by humanity.
After Charlie here, you can't believe in democracy and despise the electors. You just can't do it. I'm not on board with that.
Well, if I were to complete my sentence, what I would have said, there is no system of governance that's been created, that there's, including democracy, whatever that is exactly, and wherever one might find it being practiced, which is certainly nowhere where I live, for example. But wherever that may be, there's no reason to believe that any of these systems of governance that this species has developed are adequate to the challenges that we face. Now, I don't say that in celebration or to dance on the grave of liberalism or anything like that. It's just to talk about the seriousness of the issues that we face and our lack of experience as a species in dealing with things of this scale.
Singapore, the Netherlands, they're responding very, very quickly and with general sort of social consensus. And that's interesting because they're two such different political systems.
And very small scale.
Very small scale.
One last question.
So I don't quite know where to start, but first I wanted to say something about, we're all involved in political economies, and I just wanted to point out that I'm the fifth guy coming to ask questions in a panel that's mostly guys, and I'm sort of curious about that reality and that so if a woman would like to speak now, I'm willing to step down first.
Okay, I'll just say one thing.
We'll have two more questions.
I felt a strange twitching in my breasts when somebody mentioned that women were the feeders. And I want a clarification on that point from you guys.
Well,
That was you. With
Yes.
Animal conflict?
but it was about
No,
that's.
I didn't say that.
You misheard.
No, it was in response to what Akil was saying about nature and the notion that nature could be reduced to a notion of resource. And what I was saying is that in Melanie Klein's theory of infant development, that we start off in relation to mothers whom we experience as resources, and whom we experience as resources without limit. And that this momentously, this mode of experience undergoes a transformation, at which point this once limitless resource becomes limited and is recognized as something more and other than a resource. And that transformation of it into her seemed to me and seems now to me to be congruent with what Akil was saying about a transformation that went in the other direction, from her to it, from nature as something like a living being, something like her, beyond the reach of the study of her resources, and that vision of nature, or not vision, but I don't know what to say, sense of nature, might have been lost when changed into that which natural science can study and that which from which we can extract. That's how that came up.
So, yeah, thanks for the clarification. And in fact, nature is often referred to as a woman because of the unpredictability of it. Hurricanes, which are now himicanes or whatever, we're now having masculine names for that. And I think it is time. I was so proud. I'm watching my sister here, feeling a sense of camaraderie. And I do encourage more women to be here and participating, schlep over, go on the subway, deal with it, and just be here. I'm talking to the people in outer space who are watching us. Thank you.
You know, I do have to say, one interesting thing about what you're saying is that, having sort of imbibed massively of the climate change discourse, it is very striking that it's an overwhelmingly Eurocentric, Western, and male discourse. Even though there are, Naomi Klein, Naomi Oreskes, there are these great figures, but it is strange how that discourse is. Considering, as you say, that it's Asians who are going to be hit, and Africans and so on. How few Asian and African voices participate in this discourse?
Well, I have to say that's not completely fair. I mean, to some extent that's true. It's less true than it used to be. But for example, the IPCC works very, very hard at inclusiveness, and I think that should at least be acknowledged.
But does anybody know exactly why Morales and the Latin Americans walked out of Copenhagen?
Well, I think it was overdetermined, honestly, but...
So I have another kind of statement and question. So I don't know if other people in the room feel this as well, but I felt that there was a certain lack of forward-looking kind of part of the element in this discussion, and I'd love to invite you, for whatever the time we have left, to do that a little bit, with the preface that I think, Amitav, you're talking about part of the current problem being dating back to the 17th century. I want to suggest that it might go back 10,000 years, but definitely it goes back to the Quattrocento and like the invention of perspective and those kind of precursors to science, to the invention of science, which objectified nature, allow us to manipulate it. So there's a deep involvement of science and industrialization together as a kind of immediate cause of climate change, in which individualism is also tied. And to kind of counterbalance that, I think we're at a moment where there's also a possible opportunity in this tragedy, and that is there's a moment of realization that we are part of a larger collective. And I think it's apparent in the disciplinary space where people are more and more trying to work across disciplines, and in the cultural space, in the fact that we are acknowledging that we are many cultures and that we're polyphonic, and that the solutions will be polyphonic. Of course, there's political forces that go against that. But so just to give you a little context, I'm an artist. I work with scientists on this project called the Ocean Memory Project, where we look at memory not as a rear-looking process, but as a forward-looking process, and that's integral to nature or to the ocean. So I'm sort of curious about, you as intelligence in the room and our larger group, thinking about our ability to look forward, not necessarily with hope or with a positive outlook, but just to see what is existent in the moment to take advantage of. I feel like climate change is forcing us to face some of our own demons in ways that we wouldn't need to if it weren't there, and that's an amazing opportunity. So I'm just curious, if you were to now, okay, you've had your rear-looking analysis. If for 2 minutes you were to look forward in a hopeful or not a hopeful way in terms of what does this moment, what are the opportunities in the present to be better, to be worse, I don't know, but if you were to go forward from now.
Okay.
John, you wanted to say?
Well, does climate change force us to do something? That was the premise of the question. And I'm interested in this word force, and I think it intersects with what you were saying earlier about regulation. That is, under what conditions are humans forced to do something? How does that happen? What is the force that forces us? And it seems to me it's extremely elusive. Most of us are not forced at all. That seems to me the problem. Whatever we mean by individualism, we includes the individual's capacity to evade forces. And not only that, to celebrate that evasion as power. I am powerful to the extent that I am free from the influence of forces.
That's a tremendously deep question, actually. I mean, it's so deep that it's
well, he raised it.
It's almost, it's intractable. But one of the things to think about in responding to it, no doubt very much on the surface, is that sometime after Westphalia, we really began to think that human beings can be made better by making them over into citizens. Right? Yes. Laws and constitutions.
That didn't go so well.
No.
Alas.
Sorry?
Alas and alack. Yes. That didn't go off so well.
And we might have to say it didn't work.
Yes.
And that's really, one symptom of how hard that question is. I mean, you can't understand the Enlightenment and all its codes and constitutions without seeing that aspiration as underlying it, that you can make human beings better. What's bad in us can be made better by making us over into citizens. It just hasn't worked.
Yeah, but
part of the question was
about
the future.
Right.
But by citizens, I mean forcing us through laws and constitutions to be different, which is really what you're seeking. So that's one level at which it just didn't work.
Do we have a Singapore and the Netherlands? Do we have it? It's painful to be in on this conversation and to hear that question and not be able to jump forward
I have to say that I really disagree with the premise of that question in the sense that I think this whole business of hope, as Naveen pointed out earlier, is something that arises out of this whole sort of bourgeois society which creates the problem in the first place. I mean, if you think of other societies, if you think of pre-modern societies, human beings were always intensely aware of their precariousness. You know, that didn't make them hopeless, but it made them very aware that they were always in danger. That is what we want people to wake up to.
Yes.
You're in danger. This is what it is. Life is not the smiling liberal paradise that you were promised.
It's actually very interesting, Namita, because sometime amongst philosophers, we stopped talking about what it would be to cope, and we started saying, what would it take for us to flourish?
Yes, I know.
Flourish.
Flourish, I know. Human flourish.
I don't want to flourish. I just want to go for long walks and listen to music and read. I don't want to flourish.
Well, it seems to me we're maybe conflating the notion of what compels us with regards to forces. It's not what compels us, but what impels us. And I would hate to conflate those two notions. And someone said earlier regarding, because I see this as a moral challenge, a moral imperative. And when we talk about morality, you are alluding to subjectivity. The moral problem is not something, it evolves to a collective action, but ultimately it's a subjective experience. So the question is not what compels us, which it is a practical question. The question, I think, that precedes that is what impels you, not us. What impels you? Start there, and then examine the organic evolution of that question. If that makes sense. So I would hate to conflate the notion of what compels you to what impels you. That's all.
All right, one response, then we
Well, I'm afraid that what I have to say is very simple, literal, and flat-footed in relation to what I took the question to be. So, and it's just really to make a couple points. One is there's some obvious things that are going to be different. Most parts, I mean, let's just take the United States. Most parts of the United States where the landmass was created by filling in, which includes parts of New York, are not going to exist by the end of the century. There are ways of eating and ways of life. It's much harder to be quite specific about that we know that by the end of the century are no longer going to exist. And as we go out further, it's going to, it's going to become a little less certain which those things are, but some we can identify now. Now, this is the interesting psychological point to me, that much that we do under constraint, or however we want to characterize this, we don't think of as doing under constraint. I joyfully get on the internet every day, even though if I were not on the internet, I would be unable to do my job. There's a sense in which I'm sort of compelled to be on the internet. People who got telephones in my parents' generation saw this in some way as a positive choice, I suppose. But from another point of view, they were socially coerced, actually, to have a telephone in order to take part in a life that made livelihood possible. Many people who smoked in the last generation didn't feel that they might have felt that taking up cigarettes was a positive choice. But the power of social conformity was incredibly strong. And now the same thing is true on the other side. So one of the kind of weirdnesses here in terms of lining up the subjectivity with the objectivity is that we often don't see the social facts that condition and constrain and even coerce us as being independent of our preferences and choices.
That's an excellent ending point. So thank you all. Oh, we have another.
Well, just one final thing to build on that. I think that the solutions are social. We know how to do it scientifically. We know what needs to be done in many ways in terms of changing things physical. But now we're grasping, and that's what part of this discussion is how do we find the social way to make this happen? Personally, I think that's going to be a really hard task.
Thank you.
Bunch of different conversations.
Thank you.